Alice in Chains would release their sophomore album Dirt in 1992. It would be one of the darkest records to come out of the grunge movement. It would also be hailed as some of the band's best work, and while the album's lyrics focused on several themes, the media and fans chose to focus on the theme of drug use. If the group's debut record Facelift represented a hungry band wanting to prove themselves, then Dirt was a band coming to terms with their success and the dark side of fame. Drummer Sean Kinney perfectly summarized the album, revealing in the book Grunge is Dead, "Drugs were taking over. We were doing whatever we could get our hands on, and as much. It definitely started working against us. That record people could probably identify with. It's all right there. It's laid out, explained exactly what we were doing, what we were going through. That's a tough album for me. People are like, that's your greatest record? It's bittersweet." Today, let's explore the making of the album Dirt. We can't really talk about Dirt without discussing frontman Layne Staley's drug use. Several books, including Alice in Chains: The Untold Story and Everybody Loves Our Town, document Staley's first run-in with heroin as happening during the band's 1991 tour with Van Halen. I've done a whole in-depth video on that tour, the link is down below. Staley would even admit during an interview with the now defunct Meat magazine, "I was the effed up kid who didn't fit in. At the age of 14, he would turn to drugs, adding, 'I experimented with a lot of them. I like to say I'm a 13-year drug research analyst,' he'd jokingly say. It would be Facelift and Dirt producer David Jordan who first noticed a change in Layne's behavior when he visited the band during their Van Halen tour. Jordan would tell author David DeSola in the book Alice in Chains: The Untold Story, Layne was definitely acting different at that point. Layne was usually gregarious and cracking jokes all the time. I went to their tour bus and saw the band before the concert, and Layne was really quiet. I didn't know what was up with him." Jordan would ask the frontman, "How does it feel to be famous?" To which Layne responded, "It's freaking me out. People treat me like an object. I'm not a person anymore. I'm just a commodity to be sold. People don't really know who I am. People grab things from me," he'd recall. Fellow musician David Duet would stay with Layne and his girlfriend Demery for a short period of time in the early 90s, revealing in the book Everybody Loves Our Town how he knew the end was near for both of them, recalling, "I went back to Houston where I was working at a nightclub and the phone rang in the office. This was probably 91. It was Layne and Demery, and they had to find me to tell me that they started doing dope and how wonderful it was. And right then, I knew they were goners. You can just tell when you talk to certain people, especially females. You can tell when they're lifers. Very seldom been wrong," he'd say. Based on interviews to those close to Staley from the same book, it was sometime during the second half of 1991 and early 1992 that the frontman went to rehab for the first time to kick his habit after family and friends staged an intervention. Staley would admit to Meat magazine that it was during the making of the group's first EP, SAP, that he was in the throes of his addiction. Staley would head to Monroe, Washington, and for the frontman, he wanted to keep things quiet and keep a low profile, but those hopes would be quickly dashed. One of the other patients at the clinic would buy a VHS copy of the band's performance at the Moore Theater in Seattle and had it playing on the television during visiting hours. Kathleen Austin, who was a friend of Staley's, would tell author David DeSola, Layne was devastated. He started to cry because from that point on, he wasn't a guy with an addiction problem going to treatment, he was Alice in Chains. Layne's mother, Nancy, would state in numerous interviews over the years that her son, throughout his life, would go to rehab at least a dozen times. Shortly after the release of Facelift, Layne would live with a man named Damon Stewart, who happened to work for the band's label Sony. He would admit in the book Everybody Loves Our Town that the label was asking Damon to feed them information on whether Layne was using or not. Damon would say that Layne didn't hide his addiction, but at the same time, he didn't want to sell out his friend. It got to the point where Damon stopped living with Layne. It was during the Facelift and pre-Dirt era that the band was being managed by Pearl Jam manager Kelly Curtis and Susan Silver. Curtis would soon bow out of managing the band, recalling in the book Everybody Loves Our Town, "There was a lot going on with Alice in Chains. I just had a little girl and I remember Layne was holding her once and he nodded out and I thought, I don't want to do this anymore. He was a great guy. All those guys were great, but there was a dark cloud over them and it really affected me. I hated it." It was following Staley's first stint in rehab that the band began work on demos for their Dirt album at London Bridge Studios with Pearl Jam producer Rick Parashar. Layne would admit to Meat magazine that the band had about 5 songs ready to go, but told their label they actually had a dozen, enough for an album. The band was soon playing catch-up, writing new material for the record, with even Layne getting more involved with the songwriting process, telling the publication, "During the rehearsal time, I got a 4-track recorder and I'd never picked up a guitar before, but I used it to put down a drum track and 3 really bad guitar tracks. These would result in the songs Hate to Feel and Angry Chair. Engineer David Hillis would also point to Alice in Chains' extensive tour for Facelift as broadening the band's musical repertoire, telling author David DeSola, "With Dirt, I remember Layne getting into Slayer. I don't know how much that influenced him, but I remember that because Layne would talk to me about that kind of stuff because he knew my background from the earlier metal days and that my band Mace had opened for Slayer. Alice in Chains would open for Slayer as part of the Clash of the Titans tour in 1991. Guitarist Jerry Cantrell would look back at the evolution of the band's sound from Facelift to Dirt, recalling in the book Grunge is Dead. We were coming up with all this stuff that was just aggro, super powerful, very heavy lyrical content. It was a serious step up from Facelift. I equate it as far as artistically to Nirvana from Bleach to Nevermind. To many people, it's a record unto itself," he'd recall. The band would head down to Los Angeles to record Dirt, utilizing El Dorado Studios and One-on-One. In order to keep Layne focused on recording the record, the band worked with an addiction specialist who served as Staley's sponsor as well, a man named Bob Timmons. But Timmons seemed to rub producer David Jordan the wrong way, with Jordan blaming Timmons' behavior for contributing to Layne's relapse during the recording sessions. Jordan would tell David DeSola that Timmons was bragging around town about how he was working with Alice in Chains, going on to say he was notorious for doing interventions on bands where he would just show up at a gig where the band's playing and he'd charge $40,000 for an intervention. AA is supposed to be for free, and this guy is charging more for what Layne could have gotten for free. Jordan would go on to claim that once Layne got wind of Timmons bragging about his work with Alice in Chains, the frontman relapsed. While Layne was struggling with his own demons during the recording of the album, it would also be external factors that came up while the band was in Los Angeles. Within a few days of the recording sessions beginning in April of 1992, the LA riots broke out after a grand jury acquitted 4 police officers in the beating of Rodney King. A week of carnage resulted in nearly 60 people dying and $1 billion worth of damage. The recording of Dirt would come to a halt for about a week. And engineer Brian Karlstrom, who worked on the record, recounted that time, telling author David DeSola, "At the time, it didn't seem that significant. Now, after hearing the vibe of the album, it's just so symbolic of Layne's life. Literally a city on fire. It was the perfect backdrop to what the album would be about." Producer David Jordan would claim that Layne would sneak out after the city's curfew to score drugs in downtown Los Angeles. Cantrell would describe how the riots affected the overall feel of the album, recalling, "I was actually in a store buying some beer when some guy came in and started looting the place. I also got stuck in traffic and saw people pulling other people out of their cars and beating the crap out of them. That was some pretty scary shit to have to go through and definitely affected the overall feel of the album." It was during the time the sessions came to a halt that the band members headed out to Joshua Tree with Slayer's Tom Araya. Araya, unbeknownst to a lot of people, appeared on the track Iron Gland. Fans would get an early sneak peek of Dirt when the band recorded the song Wood for the soundtrack for the Cameron Crowe film Singles. The song was penned as a tribute to former Mother Love Bone frontman and friend of the group Andrew Wood, who passed away due to a drug overdose. Cantrell would look back at the song, recalling, "I was thinking a lot about Andrew Wood at the time. We always had a great time when we did hang out, much like Chris Cornell and I do. There was never really a serious moment or conversation. It was all fun. Andy was a hilarious guy, full of life, and it was really sad to lose him. But I always hate people who judge the decisions others make, so it was directed towards people who pass judgments." The shoot for the video would also foreshadow the band's demise. Wood director Josh Taft would tell author David DeSola, "It was hard to get it done, and we got it done, and it was good in the end. But that wasn't the experience of Live Facelift, which he also directed. It was all kind of just the innocence was starting to unravel and get a little more complicated, and you could see that in the room kind of happening. I considered Jerry my friend, and I could sort of see what he was going through to try and keep it going." It was during the recording of the album that Layne came up with his signature vocal style, sometimes referred to as stacked vocals, basically layering several vocal tracks on top of each other. It was also during the recording sessions that Layne didn't want others in the studio to see him singing. According to DeSola's book, Layne would ask for a makeshift wall of soundproof material with a small shrine consisting of candles, a picture of the Last Supper, and a deceased puppy in the jar to be in his vocal booth. When it came to the drums, producer David Jordan would credit Metallica drummer Lars Ulrich for Dirt's drum sound, recalling to Music Radar. "We recorded it at One-on-One, where Metallica did their Black album. Lars told me that he had this 31-inch woofer for his kick drum. I rented a PA system and put the kick drum, toms, and snare through this woofer, plus 3 huge side monitors. That went into the room sound, and it made the drums sound like artillery going off. I credit Lars with turning me on to that room, he'd recall. Not everyone was having such an easy time putting their mark on the album. Bassist Mike Starr would write the song Fear the Voices, but it was kept off the record. Starr would claim in the book Everybody Loves Our Town that Cantrell didn't want it on the record since he had nothing to do with writing it, and the song would end up in a box set the band released years later. While the album would produce some of the band's biggest hits in Them Bones, Rooster, Down in a Hole, Angry Chair, and Wood, it would be the deeper cuts that, along with Angry Chair, summarized Layne's struggle with addiction, including Junkhead, Godsmack, and Hate to Feel. These songs detail the initial euphoria to the inevitable crash of addiction. Jerry would perfectly summarize the 5 songs on the second side of the album detailing Layne's struggle, telling author Mark Yarm, "Those 5 songs on the second side from Junkhead to Angry Chair are in sequence because it tells a story. It starts out with a really young, naive attitude in Junkhead, like drugs are great, sex is great, rock and roll, yeah. Then it progresses, there's a little bit of realization of what it's about, and that ain't what it's about." One of the most personal songs wouldn't deal with drugs, but the Vietnam War on the song Rooster. The track would be inspired by Cantrell's father's time in Vietnam, and I've done a whole video on the song Rooster, the link is down below. The album would also cover other topics including relationships, which would be captured on the songs Damn That River and my personal favorite, Rain When I Die. While the finger could easily be pointed at Layne Staley for being solely responsible for the band's woes during this time, guitarist Jerry Cantrell was quick to look inwards, revealing, "So to point the finger at Layne might as well point the finger at all of us. Unfortunately, he's the lead singer, and the lyrical content of what he was writing, he was putting it out there. I always thought that it was very brave of him, and I always stood behind that. It's a type of thing that we always supported ourselves in, going all the way with it." While many people may think that the woman on the cover of Alice in Chains' Dirt album was frontman Layne Staley's girlfriend Demery, it's not. So who was the woman on the cover? Well, she was a model named Maria O'Brien. O'Brien had previously worked with Schenk, appearing on the cover of Spinal Tap's album Bitch School. Schenk would tell Revolver his vision of the album cover, recalling, "I wanted this cover to have a rather hellish atmosphere. It was their idea, referring to the band, to have a nude woman half buried in the desert. She could be either dead or alive." In reality, the album cover shoot wouldn't take place in the desert, but in Schenk's Hollywood studio, which gave him a lot more control over the background and lighting. He would end up constructing the set out of clay and painted the sky background. Released on September 29, 1992, Dirt peaked at number 6 on the Billboard 200 charts and went multi-platinum stateside, surprising the band. The tour to support the album was equally fraught with problems, as bassist Mike Starr would be fired from the group and replaced by Mike Inez. The media coverage from the lyrical nature of the album led some to criticize the band for glorifying drug use, but the members saw it as more of a cautionary tale. Staley would sum up Dirt, telling Spin magazine in 1993, "It's simple. One theme is drugs are bad, the other theme is relationships are bad, the last theme is album good." The tour to support Dirt was full of excess and internal problems. While it would represent the last major tour the band did with Staley fronting the group, manager Susan Silver would tell author Greg Prado in the book Grunge is Dead, "By the beginning of the tour cycle with Dirt, it was something that I was dealing with every day. And through that cycle, there were many cancellations and incidences, but Layne never gave up hope." That does it for today's video, guys. Thanks for watching. Be sure to like button and subscribe, and we'll see you again on Rock and Roll True Stories. Take care.